to make the transition, you have conversations with David Saint-Vincent and Jean-Pierre Coutron. I've had conversations for a long time on a theme that I believe is important. It's understanding addiction not from a medical perspective, but from a societal perspective. What is the modernity of the phenomenon? How the transgenerational impact, all that. So David Saint-Vincent, who's the General Secretary of the Addiction Federation, is kind enough to come and present his point of view and thinking, which for me make great sense. And David is also a addiction specialist, a specialist in adolescents and difficult teenagers. So he has also a transitional perspective, and he's not just a thinker; he's also a clinician. And unfortunately, you need to see patients from time to time. I agree with that. And so he does that in Normandy at the Passerelle Center. So thank you for coming, being here, David. So I'm not going to add any more because we're already 5 minutes late. But thank you, David.
Oui, formidable.
Ça va ça? Ok, super, ça c'est clair.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Christophe, Sauerwein, for your invitation. I hope I'm going to be worthy of your introduction. I'll let you be the judge. So I'm not going to introduce myself. That was Christophe did it brilliantly, and I would never have done better. Today I'm going to try to talk about what we try to understand in terms of an addictive society. The idea is to take a sidestep with respect to behavior and the events that we see in the news that you can see if you're French. The very recent debate, for example, which comes around regularly on the legalization of cannabis. Maybe we'll talk about this later, but I wanted to take a sidestep and see to what extent addiction is a modern phenomenon. So once again, we need to take a step back to understand the perspective. You probably know Professor Charcot, who at the start of the 20th century offered a hypnosis method for hysterical people. And it wouldn't have escaped you that hysteria is no longer a pathology that's fashionable. So it makes us think that maybe hysteria that we don't see too much or far less as the start of the 20th century, it's probably because the society we live in mean that the pressure on sexuality, and in particular for women, has been lessened. So the pathologies that result evolve based on the cultural context you live in. So I'm not making this up. It was Freud already. I haven't invented anything. Freud already spoke about culture as being a way of civilizing our instincts and drives. So if you want to think about our behaviors and at the other extreme, the pathologies that result, you can't separate it from the context, the cultural context we live in. So the thesis that I am explaining here is that at this specific point in time, with a fast-moving society, some people have been calling it the Anthropocene since the 1950s, where technological evolution is changing the way we live together, how we understand our environment and the world as a whole. We can qualify this society as an addictive society, and that helps us understand that the modern liberal free market capitalistic society we live in has an addictive function. It drives us to have addictive behavior. namely, in other words, addictions are modern pathology. So I'll take 3 elements that I'm going to try and break down with you, and maybe we can then get back talk more about this in the discussion. Firstly, there is a deregulation society. So, in what way is addiction a response to this deregulation? There's a society of performance and obsolescence, and what impact that can have in us on our existence, and all the phenomena around instantaneity and precariousness and the consequences of that. So I can tell you to start with that I'm not reactionary. I don't want to imply that or let you think that things were better before, and that we should go back to the good old days. That's not what I'm saying. Maybe I could say that later, but in concrete terms, even if we have an addictive society, it doesn't mean that we have to reject it. We can also enjoy being in an addictive society because we have our own destiny, and this is just the dark side of the situation. So in terms of deregulation, first of all, we can see that over the years, society has been organized. The way society has been organized has been shaken up. This is not new. It's through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, with the birth of intimacy and self-determination. Industrial societies have continued along this logic of shaking up social organization, the way a society is organized. And with industrialization, at the end of the 19th and start of the 20th century, we have seen a massive rural exodus that has caused or imposed a lot of the reorganization of the social fabric. Before, everyone was identified and was recognized as and could position themselves in a village where everyone knew each other. Little by little, the rural exodus has made people anonymous. People have been drowned in a mass of people. The photo you can see on the left shows that there was resistance to this rural exodus. You can see that in Paris, in the different neighborhoods. For those of you who know Paris, you know there's Breton neighborhoods, there are Corsican neighborhoods, there's Auvergne neighborhoods. This doesn't exist too much anymore, but there was a certain reorganization in reaction to this industrialization. Okay, so people moved to big cities to work, but they got back together by neighborhoods, depending on where they came from, to create ties. And what we're seeing today, especially through social media and new methods of socialization, is that these ties are more virtual, less physical. The associations, the ties we make are based on interests, by memes, by shared passions, shared interests, and by algorithms that determine for us what our probable future affinities will be, and they organize associations either that we've anticipated, for example, through a Facebook group, or an algorithm will just do that work for us on our behalf and recommend a person. This person is made for you, and that is more the method of a dating website, for example. And the consequences of this is that these affinities are more instantaneous and interchangeable, and we can ignore these affinities. I'm not confronted with an object which can be positive and frustrating. I'm thinking of the challenge of accepting that I am someone, an individual, but I'm finite. I need someone, and this interdependency it creates these social ties. With these virtual communities, we have a powerful illusion where you can pick and choose left and right from partial objects, and it makes this dialectic vulnerable, this dialectic between I like this person, but this part of them, I don't like them, or don't like this part of them. Here, the technology allows us to ignore the parts of people that we don't like. One of the consequences of this that you can hear is the increase in the number of divorces. A consumer-oriented approach to couples or relationships. So, okay, this is a bit stereotypical. It's a bit of a caricature that I'm making. So I apologize for that. It's just to clarify my position. I don't want to caricature the situation. So I love this photo. In France, there's a debate on national service, universal national services. So my intention is not to throw myself into this polemic, but what has changed a lot in the last few decades is that previously we had rites of passage, which would structure our previous traditional societies. So these rites of passage have had an extremely important function in all cultures. And a very good example of that is military service. So I'm not implying that I'm not nostalgic for military service, but we need to think about the purpose of military service, which was it was reserved to men, but had a very vertical top-down function where the state created a national community through the military service and put people together from different social stratas with different aspirations. So military service can be traumatic for some people and even lead to addictive behavior. But these societal organizations, are disappearing little by little without us being able to, until now, in any case, we don't know how to organize that. There have been different opinions on the left and the right, but we're going through a transitional phase. And the other parallel I have is the spring break. And here we can see that despite these very rigid organizational structures that were experienced as being rigid and therefore undesirable, have been replaced by social organizations that continued, that persist. And this is the case of spring break, where people need to get together to mark the end of a period, the start of a new one. And here, typically, or the end of high school to go to university, you can invent different organizations as well. For example, in business schools or medical schools, they organize parties where there is an element, an idea of creating a community, which is very important. The difference there is that it is far more homogeneous in terms of the social characteristics. It's the spring break in Concord, for example, in 2016. Of course, you need to have enough money to buy a ticket. You need to have the physical characteristics to be able to attend it. In the photo, you can see they were young and muscular. Not everyone fits the mold, unfortunately. So it is still something that is a logic based on a logic of consumption, focused on, or rather directed by commercial operators who organize these parties. You can also see these consumption behavior, hypersexualization also present in these events. So we have paradoxical social measures. You have one model that recommends normality, rigidity, rigor, and another one is surpassing one's limits. And I haven't spoken about screens yet, but in our we in our modern societies we're overstressed. We're exposed to a lot of auditory and visual stimuli, which leads us to either accept this hyper-consumption or adopt avoidance strategies. And I think everyone can imagine the different approaches between the hypnotic people who want to be in their bubble and on the other side maximizing the party experience. So the most important thing is that it's feelings that overrides emotion. Excess is becoming the norm rather than transgressing one's limits. And in this context, you can see how binge drinking, that we speak a lot about, and the adults are justifiably alarmed about. But we can see how this type of consumption is just a modern type of consumption. You can see in a recent investigation by a French observatory watchdog. We've gone from a Latin moderate consumption model, which leads to pathologies, conditions of damaging the liver, but to less frequent but far more damaging types of consumption. And this is simply a more modern type of consumption. This is a consumption, a society of more and of excess, individualization, and the binge drinking is just meeting this demand for individualization and excess with the conditions. The resulting conditions, the risk is less of cancer, but more of accidents related to the neurological damage and other type of risk caused by Anglo-Saxon types of consumption. One of the possible effects, and I'm underlining possible here because this is not fatalistic, but with this social organization through the meme or proximity, we evacuate generational conflict and generational educational conflict. What is difficult in this organization is transmission, passing down information. Types of consumption, even consumption of IT. When I started as a consultant for young people, you could see how there's a generational gap between the consumption of cannabis by teenagers in the year 2000s and the consumption their parents may have had in the 70s. The mode of consumption is completely different. So there was a difficult to make a connection, to have a dialogue between the two worlds. And this contaminates many aspects of our life. So it's difficult to pass this on through the generations. And when I say pass this on, it's not necessarily harmonious, but it's more conflictual. You know that teenagers, to develop, need this conflict, both to situate themselves in relation to their education, and also to add what they can see from society, from the world, and what they want to adopt. So becoming an adult is all about creating your own, taking what you want from what your parents give you and what you see from society. So this poses a problem in terms of the generational conflict. The parents themselves, their educational role is invalidated because we're told that we need to be cool, that you can't create limits, creating limits, or at least some people can have this impression that parents having difficulty. for example, a typical example is a parent who smokes is difficult to forbid the teenager from smoking. The idea here is not to passing down or what you do as a parent. It's also to know where to set limits, and so this creates a greater gap between the teenagers and adults, and paradoxically, is and the teenager tends to internalize this conflict rather than evacuating it. And rather than talking to the parents, it will be a source of internal tension, which will create guilt and sometimes violence in the teenager who is vulnerable to this internal conflict. So it raises the question of individual and sustainable continuity with information that is increasingly sequenced and fleeting.
Alors, société de la
So performance and obsolescence. I took an example, it's just one example amongst others. It's worth what it's worth, yes, but what I find interesting is to what extent that our technologies have evolved and how exponentially this evolution has accelerated. This is just one example. So we used to have calculating machines in China with poles in first millennium before Jesus Christ, and then the first calculator of Pascal. It took about 2,000 years, but between the first phone invented by Graham Bell and the first mobile phone that could be used for something else than telephone communication. You all know that model, of course, which is, I think, a bit of a legend. That only took 130 years. So you could take a lot of other examples as well. Let's say, in order to reach 50 million radios in the world, it took 38 years. To end up with 50 million television sets, it took 14 years. 50 million people connected to the internet within the space of 4 years. So you could see the huge expansion and acceleration of technologies and their diffusion as well, their presence in society, which has a strong impact on our social organizations. We have regulations that are set up by societies in order to face the very rapid advancement and progress of those technologies, but it's very hard for us to keep up the rhythm. So, as I was saying, it's going to really shake up the transmission of experience. It's going to disrupt as well. I mean, let me take another example, that of inflation of molecules. You have a lot of new treatments these days. And you could see today that when you're a general practitioner, when you're a GP, previously you could have said, an older doctor might be more experienced, might be more professional. It's a guarantee of high quality. But nowadays, because we have so many new treatments coming on the market every year, being an older doctor nearer your pension is a bit of a guarantee that you will be obsolete or a bit old-fashioned. Of course, a patient does not only expect treatment from a GP. I know that older GPs probably have other types of experiences, not just knowing modern molecules, but still it's very disruptive. And you see a lot more molecules, a lot more treatments, and it's very difficult for the human spirit, I guess, in spite of all the cognitive capacities that we have. It's still very difficult for us to face those rapid changes. It goes faster for a GP to read the drugs, the medicine's information, or to believe what they are told about the medicine, rather than, they don't really have time to read the different data and studies and so on and so forth, because otherwise they wouldn't even have time, they wouldn't be finished before the new molecule hits the market. So you could see also there are changes that disrupt the progress of science. Let's say baclofen, for example. That's a molecule that was said to work. Users came and asked for baclofen as a treatment. Sometimes it was, they idealized it a little, but sometimes it was a good idea for them to take it because of alcohol use. And when baclofen arrived, the doctors were a little unsettled because they didn't have a lot of scientific data and scientific regulation, which made it possible to have robust, solid data on which to base your treatment decision-making process in order to have an intelligent framework. You end up with very strong tensions between those two aspects, between demand and offer. That is not always structured enough. Sports is another very good example of that performance society and obsolescence society as well. I went for Citius Altius Fortius in that context, so always higher, faster, stronger. And in 2019, you do get the feeling that we have reached our limits in terms of human capacities. At least this is the overwhelming feeling, I suppose. And it's a bit paradoxical, but we still have that demand for performance, which is clearly stated, but at the back of it, there's rising panic because you notice the consequences of this performance, i.e. doping in a lot of cases. And the question of doping is not only limited to sports. Performance also has to be present in the work environment. So doping behaviors or doping stricter sense is definitely something that you need to take into account within organizations, and management methods are not very aware yet of how an organization may at some point lead to doping behaviors or even sometimes actual doping. In such circumstances, you also have the idea of transhumanism. I'm thinking of Oscar Pistorius. We noticed that a person who was disabled could run faster than a person with two legs. So it really changed the paradigm, which is a very good thing for the inclusion of disabled people. But it does beg the question: we now have technical tools that are. It gives us the impression that the limits of human beings can be evacuated. We can get rid of them through technology, from a sports perspective, but also we do have algorithms now that can make a justice decision, for example, that can render a judgment. We have conversation agents that can be a substitute for caregivers in a hospital context, for example. So, I mean, don't want to create panic on those questions, but still those are questions we need to ask ourselves. We do have that idea that, finally, we no longer need to ask ourselves, we no longer need to worry about imperfection of human beings, we no longer need to worry about the limits of human beings, because those limits we find unbearable, but they are also what makes us human and what makes human life interesting to some extent. As an adult, I guess maybe it's not that bad, but when a teenager is building their personality, accepting that question of having limits and tolerating the fact that those limits constitutes what we are, and they are also an added value for us, because it creates social links in the social fabric. This is an element of our education that is probably is going to lose in value. I think we need to find new ways of dealing with those questions. Another example is the question of biohacking. It's a very fashionable term. We no longer really talk about drug use or doping behaviors, but we talk about biohacking. And you see how those terms really ask questions as well. We really do have a digitalization, or I don't know, we understand the human being in more and more IT terms, I guess. So it's no longer drug use, it's biohacking. So you reprogram your spirit, your brain, your consciousness. the question of instantaneity and precariousness, I mean, I don't want to point the fingers at those brands at all. It's not my point at all. But I'm just saying that all those services that are offered here are offered super easily. It's a one-click type of situation. And we're in a situation where it's no longer necessary to prioritize our wishes, our desires, not even our needs, but just our desires. We have everything available at once, and we do have the possibility to satisfy our impulses in a nearly instantaneous manner. The consequence of which is that it leads to a precariousness of the experience. Things are more and more, things happen in sequence more and more. You're no longer in a world where it was important to access information. Now what's at stake is sorting through and analyzing information. Accessing information is not so difficult. What's important is to sort through it. And I think that's an important point to make because it does create a different context in terms of our educational positions. Instantaneity and acceleration means that experience transmission no longer occurs properly. For example, someone who works at Uber or Deliveroo, what's at stake for them is not to determine how they will transmit their know-how to a colleague in order to improve quality. This is not what's at stake. It's no longer happening. What's at stake is we need the service to be rendered, and that's it. And the people who render that service are more or less interchangeable, which damages experience transmission, and that has consequences also in terms of our educational methods and the way that we manage transmission within families also. So, impulsiveness used to be a bad thing, used to be a complicated characteristic, and now it is something that we cultivate. It's all about not getting a headache. It's all about not letting oneself be annoyed or be bugged, It's nearly Pavlovian now. You hear the little bell, makes you hungry, and you want food now. I mean, the parallel is relatively clear with the question of addiction, because addictive behavior is in a way, shortcutting your thoughts. Even from a neurobiological perspective, you see how addiction, from the perspective of the neurobiological functioning of your brain, someone who is addicted to a product, there's a reward circuit that has been hijacked. That there's no way to regulate that reward system, and that's the whole question of neuromarketing. For example, the point of neuromarketing is to evacuate as much as we can every superior function of the brain in terms of regulating the reward system. So this is nothing new, of course. I mean, it started, you could read it in Zola's book, Le Bonheur des Dames, the Lady's Delight. It's you see the first steps of that system where you encourage needs and impulsiveness in order to sell more and sell better. And again, the question is about the evolution and also the exponential evolution of things. I can't remember who it was, but there's a book that explains that in the 50s in supermarkets you had 450 products on average. Now you have 40,000 products on average. So you have a plethora of objects and things. And I'm not even talking about e-commerce, right? But anything you want, even if it's strange or weird, it exists. And you can get it delivered within 48 hours. Of course, I'm not advertising for anyone here. And so it's no wonder that under such circumstances, you may say, okay, well, an addictive practice nowadays is not even a consequence of anything, it's promoted. So you're in a logic where what's ideal for a salesperson, regardless of what their merchandise, what their goods are, it's ideally, if you want to sell something, it's better if it's drugs. It's better if it's addictive. It's better if your consumer has an irrepressible need to continue purchasing your goods. Jean-Michel Delisle gave a presentation 2 years ago in Paris, and those are the examples he gave. And I think it's very, it's very obvious, isn't it? Dior addict. It's in the name, I guess. And you could see, the movement she makes with her fingers, which is reminiscent of a cigarette. And so it's not about controlling yourself. It's about shining and not being shy. And the other one seems very interesting to me as well. So for the most, from a continental perspective, it's the idea of an addict that ends up drinking perfume when they're on withdrawal, I guess. But for people from North America, they know what the purple drink is, which is a drug that is it's a mix of codeine syrup, which gives it the purple color, and antihistamines, and those are products that are still used during parties, and there are quite a lot of videos that show this drink in use, I guess. So it's no longer hidden at all. It's in your face, It's and the question of forbiddenness and transgression has become the norm. So there, if I had to summarize everything that I elaborated there, everything that I wanted to say, of course we encourage purchasing behaviors, and the last thing is also all that has to do with the digital world. There was one person from Facebook who did a bit of a coming out and said all the terrible things he thought about Facebook, and he said it was toxic for the social fabric. So of course we could refer to him and to the economy of attention. There was a boss of a famous French channel that said it's all about available brain time, and it's exactly what it's about, I think. Phone apps, nearly all of them, a non-negligible part of them, the idea is no longer to satisfy a need or to provide a person with a service. A lot of those apps, especially for teenagers, their only goal is to create a kind of to attract a person's attention and capture it so that the data created through that can be used for commercial purposes. This is really the environment we work in. We're no longer in a logic of providing someone with a service. I mean, of course, again, it's a caricature, but still, that idea is sometimes less important than the idea of being able to use, later down the line, human beings as a raw material that you could commercialize, that you could market. I mean, I hope I'm not depressing you, but I'll say it again. The idea is not to say, it's all going down the drain. I'm just saying that those elements, they have always existed. Those elements have always been there, but we have refined them to kind of a state-of-the-art situation. And the regulatory forces are having difficulties facing those changes, keeping up with the rhythm of those changes. And I think, again, hyper-solicitation, overstress and of a person's attention and so on and so forth. This has always existed. We've always wanted things, and it's not inappropriate in and of itself, but you still have to create that relationship with the desynchronization of all the regulatory elements that you may have in your society. I talked about military service, I talked about science, I talked about education. Parents are facing more and more difficulties in the transmission process, and I think the addictive elements, giving them the vulnerability of the transmission elements that we have, ended up in a situation that is the situation I described now. Again, I'm sure I'm confident we'll find the solution at some point, but before we can find solutions, I think maybe it's important to establish a diagnosis. So this is a summary. Hyper solicitation for purchases. That idea of wanting to have always more, to accumulate objects, items. Of course, models change every month. You could have a washing machine that you could keep. You used to be able to buy a washing machine that you could keep for 30 years, but what's the point of that? You need to stimulate consumption, speed, and immediacy. So that also has a link with transmission and experience, because an experience is shorter and shorter. It's more and more similar to a sensation. And again, drawing people's attention, capturing it, and because of that, the reorganization of the private and public sphere that leads to. All of those ingredients, I think, if some of your patients, if you meet with people who have difficulties with substance abuse, I'm sure you're familiar with what I'm saying now. And within those very refined logics, teenagers are the main targets of solicitation messages. They are vulnerable to them. Their brain is being built. Their brain is evolving. I no longer have my sources, but you could really see how, little by little, during the teenage years, also from a neurobiological perspective, the prefrontal cortex is the last structure that is established, that evolves, and so you do have an ideal target for advertising or for purchasing. To create a purchasing wish. So again, they focus on that idea of teenage years, remaining young and staying a teenager. So you have anti-aging creams, detox drinks. You could also add the products you take in order to avoid the negative effects of other products. We sometimes have people who use alcohol to compensate, the absence of heroin, or so it's always the same logic. So what's the point of taking into account the addictive society in our practices? I'm not just showing off here on stage. I'm just saying that I think it has a real consequence on the way that we consider, that we think about, first of all, the regulatory framework, but also the treatment strategy and educational strategies. We have to, those have to correspond. Those have to be in line with the society we live in. We know that the regulatory framework is no longer adapted. We could see it with the question of cannabis legalization. The temptation would be to say, we'll come back to a moral order, and that moral order will protect us. We'll create a legal norm, and that legal norm standard will create a social standard. It is not my point of view at all. I think it's BS, to be frank. But and I think it's a bit reactionary as well. But I think the question is, how can we invent a regulatory framework that is suited to today's world? So here is the Levenstein triangle, which relocates the question of addiction as being a consequence of three main factors: a person, a product, and a context. And you could never deal with the one without dealing with both others as well. You could establish priorities, of course. Sometimes it's important to focus on the question of the product, sometimes on the question of the context, but very often the question of context and social, cultural, educational environment within which you meet the persons is underestimated, at least from my perspective. And I think that's a mistake. You could also elaborate. I mean, in order to find a solution, to have a solution, I think it's important to defend an integrated approach of addiction treatment. Integrated doesn't mean everything is in everything else and you need to do absolutely everything at once. It's just it's important to have a common language so that a person, when faced with a toolbox, knows which tools best correspond to him or her. Our job is not to validate our approach or an approach which we believe is the best. The idea is rather to make it possible to show a person the many approaches that could correspond to them. And this integration is important from a treatment perspective, from a perspective of care, as a professional, but also within our institutions. It's important to be a team. It's important to work hand in hand with professionals for different backgrounds so that a doctor can work with an educator who could work with a psychologist without having any hierarchy in there, so that we may have a completely horizontal and networked vision, same as the triangle that I showed you before. We'll be finished in a minute.
So I'm going to conclude with this and explain the social and educational dimension. The model I'm presenting here is that of early intervention. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this this notion, which we get from our Swiss colleagues, which also differentiates different strategies from the individual to the more collective approach, with the answers that are suited to the different modes. And collective, it's about creating a favorable environment, limiting unfavorable situations. You can see that some people will be able to get out of a difficult background because they have the baggage that will allow them to get through peacefully out in a society of hyper solicitation, and to express their liberty. And that's the positive side of our hyper liberal society. You can see more vulnerable people who've had traumatic situations, who have cultural deficits, or who are underprivileged, are vulnerable, and which means they will be stuck in behaviors and usages that they won't be able to enjoy the fruits of this liberty. And the other resulting strategies are as follows. In collective, we're talking about promoting the ability to act. Addictology doesn't concern just addiction specialists. It concerns educators in the wider sense, whether they be teachers, parents, or bakers, or the local tradesmen. But it's about creating a favorable environment to enable or to limit the vulnerabilities that can cause by our societies. Then there's screening, and I don't mean the stigmatization of this, but the people that who are vulnerable in vulnerable situations, we need to be aware there is a risk of psychoactive products, any type of products, could become an addiction. So the idea is to identify that as early as possible, and not wait until they have to go to see a healthcare professional, and find, of course, at the end of the day, the intervention of specialists. So in conclusion, I wanted to say that supporting people who consume psychoactive products or who are addicted is essential, but we need to integrate preventive, therapeutic and civic approaches and not deal just with specialists. Thank you very much.
Merci David.
Thank you, David. Take a seat. So thank you very much, David. I have the pleasure of welcoming. That's your microphone, and that's yours. And I have this lapel microphone. So I have the pleasure of welcoming Cosmo, Duff, Gordon. It's a personal pleasure, first and foremost, and it's also a collective pleasure because I know you both, and I'm convinced today that we're going to talk about lots of interesting things. So, Dr. Cosmo, Duff, Gordon, you're not a doctor in medicine, but you have a PhD, is that correct? What's a PhD in what? Psychology. With an really eclectic vision of addiction and an Anglo-Saxon vision of addiction. So we're going to start the discussion very quickly. It's interesting, isn't it, David, to feel the dependent on a society and have to accept this the accelerating society, hyper solicitation, this tendency of performance, and that you can only perform if you dope yourself. And for me, performance is starting to become vital to society, not necessarily consumption in terms of intoxication, but this addictive society being what it is. If I'm not a stakeholder in addiction, I'm struggling. So that's somewhat depressing. But David, you finished up with this idea of norms, that whether we're in line with the social norms, medical norms, behavioural norms, and if you want to be in the norm now, it's practically addictive behaviours. And we talked last night about this difficult approach to norms. Is there a real possibility? Can we have a medical perspective on addiction?
Well, I mean, we live, obviously, as David was saying earlier, in an addicted society. I think in late capitalist society, we work and we consume. And I think the addict, on the one hand, is the paragon of capitalist society, because the addict, represents overconsumption. On the other hand, the addict threatens normative consumers, because the addict consumes with a radical loss of control. The addict is not the sort of neoliberal, autonomous, self-controlled actor. Far from it. The addict is out of control, is not autonomous, is dependent. You think of concepts like substance dependence, that is how the addict is constructed. So the addict is deviant. The addict, and in the addict's deviance, I think they construct self-controlled consumers as normative. So the question then is, if we live in an addicted society, with the addiction concept having increasingly extended in the last 100 years, from alcohol into narcotics, and then into behaviours, into sex, into food, and into work, and of course into shopping. We can talk about shopaholics, workaholics. Then addiction as a concept, in some ways, is a threat to modern society, because the two things that represent modern society, work and consumption, and are now falling within the umbrella of addiction. They can be thought of as addictive, potentially addictive disorders. Now, medicine, as we know, and this is what I was talking about with Christophe last night, medicine has really appropriated the addict. And I mean, my question, as a bit of a sort of historian of evolution of discourses of addiction, from the Middle Ages to the current times, is why does medicine, how has it happened that the medical profession has sort of appropriated the addict? Because medical models of addiction, in my view, are pretty ropey. So what are your thoughts there, David?
So why did we appropriate this? You said I was a Foucauldian earlier, and I think you're right. I can hear an echo. Sorry. So I think that I put that in the basket of hygienism. In modern society, it's all about hygiene. So the medical body has tried to regulate this mode of this social incontinence that represents the alcoholism represents. That's how it's has been structured. So, and that's how I situate. That's how I situate the appropriation of the medical bodies of it. I don't think medical is exclusively appropriated. We mustn't caricature. And I have the impression that it's urgent to change paradigm. And I think that's already underway, in fact. And in any case, I believe it's not the function, even if it was the case historically, it's not the function of the healthcare to create, is to establish norms. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, I'm not sure it does either. I mean, I don't know how you guys see it. I mean, there's probably some doctors in the room, medical doctors, but it's always been a puzzle to me, and I've worked in addiction treatment for a very long time, why the addict has become essentially the object of medical governance. Psychiatrists tend to be the people who end up running clinical treatment programs, and I think it's not at all clear to me that addiction is a medical problem. That would be, so I don't know if that answers the question. I mean, addiction fundamentally is a hybrid problem, but you can certainly argue that it's disease of the will, if it's a disease at all. In terms of medical models, the sort of biological neurolimbic system dopamine model is ropey. There are problems with that model. There's no sort of material basis really for the claim that addiction is a biological problem, and that's a reductionist model anyway that rules out all the sort of psychosocial variables. Anyway, that's how I'd see it.
Oui, alors je suis complètement d'accord.
I completely agree. I think we could use the rat park experience. It's a fairly old experiment. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but I find this experiment interesting because in many senses. Firstly, because it shows how you create a reality in the way you design a study, and also how you can deconstruct it. For those who don't know this experiment, in order to create animal models of addiction, you put a rat in a cage, you offer him a cocaine solution and a water-based solution, and eventually they'll prefer the cocaine-based solution, they'll become addicted, it's terrible, and the question of addiction is, in fact, an issue of supply and demand. So the consequences from a political point of view, political consequences of this is that you need to regulate supply. So you need to fight drug trafficking, put cops on every street corner, and get rid of consumers. So Rat Park, that Alexander did in the 1970s, is some time ago. But what it highlighted is that rather than putting rats in cages in laboratories, and you can imagine it's a very sterile environment, they put them in a big cage with games, with other mice. A creative was created, and you realize that okay. The rats experiment the use of cocaine, but ultimately only a very small proportion will become dependent because there's a social environment that you have a diversity of possibilities. So regulation, and it goes further than this in fact, because rats they do become addicted. They try to go cold turkey so they can go back to normal interactions with their peers. So the way you we created things is the fruit of a history, and this history continues. And so we need to continue to pursue this approach. The social dimension, it's true that social sciences are always seen as soft sciences, incomplete, human, with a political implication. You can see this the case also for medicine, that said. But it's maybe has taken less seriously, but it's interesting to find a better balance between medical and social sciences, and especially for addiction. there's a very important point in all this is that, so I'm going to put another layer on the table. For many years, the three of us, we have seen people with addiction issues. We use different treatments, treatment models, and the success rates. And I'm afraid to say, excuse my French, but the results are pretty shitty. I'm the first one to say it. So something's wrong. So is the problem is that it's not going against societal, civilizational trends, and that's what David's presentation was about, or are we not using obsolete models? Because something important David said is that the rate of obsolescence, when you have a fast-moving society, the obsolescence rate is squared. So we all of a certain age, and so we approach addiction at a different level as our children. So I have the impression that we are a step behind in terms of not only the solution, but in terms of understanding. I'd like you to. This is a bit provocative question, but I'd like you to react to what I just said.
Well, I think it's a very interesting point. I mean, I think it's true what Christophe is saying. It's fair to say outcomes are not particularly brilliant when it comes to addiction treatment, no matter really the modality. And I think what Christophe's saying about, the paradigms haven't particularly changed, really, in the last 40 years. You have 12-step treatment, which is obviously the dominant paradigm in America. You have harm minimization, which in England would be the dominant paradigm, possibly in France. You have CBT. You have, obviously, I think what's changed in the last 20 years has been the addict, in many ways, has been reconfigured as the victim of trauma. Addiction, maybe a movement in the last 20 years has been from away from sort of disease concept style understandings to seeing it really as self-regulation of one's internal terrain, one's internal pain from attachment trauma from childhood. And that's been a very, I think, powerful strand. But however you chop it up, outcomes are not great, but maybe that says something about the complexity of addiction. I think, for me, I would say there's no unitary pathway into addiction. I think there's multiple etiological pathways into it, and I think there's also many roads out of it. I think, if this debate is meant to be about identity and recovery, I was thinking about this last night in bed, and recovery is a very contested concept. Arguably, if you want to try and define recovery, it depends on who's doing the defining, which interest group is doing that. And I think there's many forms of addiction, many forms of recovery, but I think the poor success rate probably tells us something about the complexity of addiction. Yeah, those would be my thoughts.
Alors, je trouve justement que les Britanniques ont beaucoup de choses à nous apprendre.
I think the British have a lot of things to teach us, and they do teach us a lot, because in North America, this 12-step process, which I think is worthwhile citing, is not necessarily well suited to everyone. What the last few decades have brought us, what the British have brought us, is the housing first type approach, which I think is quite interesting. You invert the logic. Rather than saying addiction is the problem, the environment is the problem. So you don't need a strong division. And you realize if you give someone as a house, you see that their situation improves. And you can see also that for different working methods for homeless people, and there are systems for social inclusion for young people to find them work, and naturally their addictive behavior improves, and they organize themselves without even a health carer having to be involved. So the carer's place is legitimate, but we need to both we need to allow public opinion to realize that the paradigm has shifted, because we can see that in what you say, but the issue of the overall overarching paradigm is still abstinence. So abstinence is important, but there are other approaches that we need to approach. We need to allow the addict themselves to choose the approach, the relevant approach. Thank you, David.
Something about that, because you mentioned that in your talk earlier about allowing the addict to choose. See, for me, the problem with addiction is that unlike any other kind of problem, the addict tends to be the last person to realize they're addicted. That's my experience as a clinician. And addiction is characterized by self-deception, by a denial system. So the problem is that unlike other forms of therapy, I think good quality addictions treatment, which is what I do, has to be reasonably prescriptive, because you have to try and deconstruct the denial and show the addict the addiction. In fact, for me, good quality treatment is about helping the client to make a self-diagnosis of addiction. So I do depart from you on. I think when it comes to addictions treatment, yes, you got to let people find their own path, but at the same time, I think it has to be a bit more prescriptive than normal forms of psychotherapy.
I agree with that. Nevertheless, I do find it interesting, especially with alcohol, to be able to explore risk reduction related to alcohol. I'm gonna explain that. For me, denial, the alcoholic's denial in particular, is based on is a clinical observation. Okay, but to a certain extent, you can wonder why. The denial of the place of the alcoholic, and I need to explain this not necessarily just to you, but the concepts that we have around, that we try to push around, is that before being able to talk about treatment or care, we need to talk about securing consumption and their comfort zone. And while we're doing that, the person probably somatic situation continues to deteriorate. But working on the comfort zone and the safety of consumption, making sure the consumption is safe, you create an environment that will allow the person to treat themselves as a subject of their addiction. It's not going to resolve the issues of denial, but it will resolve a non-negligible part of it. We'll see in a few decades what the results of this will be, because we're still in the early stages, but I'm experimenting that in particular with the with VAPs for precarious publics, and you can see just through the behavior, because you're not vaping, rather you don't remove nicotine, but by putting someone, by choosing the mode of consumption, changing the mode of consumption, you're allowing them to naturally question their consumption without the problem. It's not just saying you have a problem with that. I mean, you can start by saying changing the perspective by saying even if someone has a difficulty financing their habits, you can change their behavior. So what you say is true, but it needs to be completed by the 80% of problematic users who won't necessarily go to care, or in any case won't go to care, because they know already, rightly or wrongly, that they will be offered abstinence, and they don't recognize that model. So this is why we have 10, 15 years behind, in alcohol in particular. But how often there's 10, 15 years between the time someone recognizes that they have a problem and when they start treatment. How much damage is caused in that time? So it doesn't mean that carers are doing things wrong, but we need to complement the way we work. Not change it necessarily, but complement it with a far more articulated approach that takes into account social dimensions and the caring dimensions in the medical sense. So and it's really a focus on risk reduction that allows us to do this. And this is an eminently British concept, risk reduction. in the case, we learnt that from you. We were very intellectual approaches. So fortunately, we're able to draw inspiration from your risk reduction techniques, which we're now exploring in. I'm talking about the experience I have in the Addiction Federation. We're exploring that in alcohol and tobacco. And paradoxically, with alcohol, risk reduction is very, very far behind schedule in the issue of opioid injections, for example. We've seen and we've proven that it has real effects, not necessarily in terms of stoppage, but it secures the damages caused by their damage. And if they want to go into care, they can. But the prospects, the outlook is not necessarily the same. Maybe I changed my hat. I'm not looking at it from a carer's approach necessarily, a health carer's approach, but just from a social inclusion approach, which has a real impact on the damage caused by this consumption. And sometimes regulating consumption is part of that, but we need more documentation on that. Going back to our dinner last night, but there's something else important, that people drink less than 5 centuries ago. We probably we've reduced our tolerance levels, but we drink less than in the olden days. So, and there is a pressure of self-regulation in our society. And I'm playing devil's advocate here, but Western civilization, through the Middle Ages and Renaissance and the modern era, and whatever you might think of feudal societies and absolute monarchies, but civilization has survived at a time when people used to drink 8 liters of cider per day, and now we're saying that we need to stop drinking, we need to be abstinent. And when you realize that when you put rats in a pleasant park, they are able to live together nicely. And here we are saying that we need to change things. So we need to break this cycle of denial. I was the first person to think that, but maybe you need to dance with denial. There's another form of denial, because if you're not an active participant in society with its avatars and its problem, that means I need to deny certain things to be part of an addictive society. I'm also excluding myself from society, and if I exclude myself from society, that can also bring on other psychological problems, which can lead to other addictive behaviors. So what do we do with this paradox?
I mean, well, maybe the good news, Christophe, is from what I read, certainly in England, millennials are drinking and taking drugs and smoking less and less and less. I know that in England, 40% of all the nightclubs that were open in 2010 have closed down since then, because there's no longer a market for them. You know, whereas my generation, we wanted to go out and get smashed and pull girls and smoke and so on. You know, youngsters are not into that. They're doing other things. So going back to Christophe's point, I think possibly, you know, if the trend is towards people drinking less, smoking less, certainly in England, I'd be interested to hear what it's like here in France. Maybe abstinence is going to have more of a receptive audience. It's actually perhaps going to become more normative to be abstinent in the future. Mad as that may seem to people of, you know, my ancient age, but it's sort of that may be the direction of travel.
Alors la régulation des
So regulation in consumption, we see that in French young people as well. There's recent research, a recent study came out 2 weeks ago, I think, and it shows that teenagers smoke less. They maybe drink a bit more, but you're right. The difference is that there's the way of articulating this behavior regulation that is different. Teenagers are more careful about their health than we were, or at least they're less prisoners of the logic that I've tried to explain in my slides. Before, we were kind of a unthinking victim, And through this educational process, taking a step back of, if you talk to a 50-year-old, when it's free, it means you're the product. When you say that to a teenager, they know exactly what you're talking about. Applications and smartphones. They know that you need to make a decision about that. But Christophe, you're right also to say that my presentation may have seemed depressing, but you need to identify that there are emerging phenomena and regulations, and so healthcare has their place in that, not as a normative agent, but as a supporter, to support both, and to accept that there are some people who have difficulty with these norms, what the difficulties created by our societies, and these difficulties are not doesn't make these people pariahs. But the addicts tell us something about our society, and they are a useful agent in that respect. As we say in France, the margin holds the page. So the addict tells us something about our society. So when you have this type of approach, you have a more inclusive approach and maybe a less criminal perspective of the addict. And I think that can also contribute to their recovery, and without thinking that any kind of behavior is acceptable, and to prevent teenagers seeing that as the model to follow. I'm not sure that's very clear, but sometimes we can tend to say we want to say something to forbid something, to be very clear, and hope that will work. That worked. This model worked in the 40s, but things don't work that way anymore. And you can see there's still a political tendency to regulate drug use by banning them, by bans, and we can see that they don't work at all. Nowadays, we're self-employed, and we're responsible for our own destiny, and I think that's problematic, but it's also wonderful. So the relationship to authority is completely exploded in this context. And so there are other ways of doing things. I mean, we had these meetings in Perpignan last week with François Julien, who presented to us a Chinese approach to support. Support is not a frontal confrontation with someone to hammer into our ideas into them, but to support them, to nudge them, if you like, towards in a certain direction, to show we have a common destiny. So rethinking support, or maybe we don't need to rethink it, but we need to stop stigmatizing addicts. And of other consumers. It's too easy to skip from a consumer to an addict.
The problem with stigma is the addict will always be stigmatized because they're caught in moral discourse. The addict, I think, probably, certainly again in England, I'm unsure in France, but in England, the addict, in terms of the common sense understanding or construction of the addict alcoholic, it would probably be that they're a weak-willed person and possibly a bit of a bad person. I suppose the advantage of medical discourse is it allows a repositioning as an illness. 12-step, of course, is very different. 12-step discourse uses medical terms like illness and like recovery, and disease, but actually it's very much a spiritual illness. It's absolutely not a medical problem, which gets confused. I think that gets lost in translation. So I think actually, medical discourse certainly has its uses, but in terms of stigma, I think the addict, and of course addicts introject that. So going back to identity, I think the identity can be that I'm weak and I'm bad. Which interestingly in America, the big precedent was Trainer versus Turnage. Are there any Americans in the room familiar with Trainer versus Turnage, 1988? There's an American basketball player who was a big boozer. And he, the quality of his play declined, and he'd had a basketball scholarship, so his scholarship was removed. And he thought that was monstrously unfair. He said it was discrimination because he had an illness called alcoholism, and he should therefore keep his scholarship. So it went to the American Supreme Court, and in 1988 they defined alcoholism as, quote, willful misconduct. So that is that's the legal basis in America for how alcoholism is constructed. In other words, it's a choice. Therefore, the addict bears moral responsibility. So I think there always probably will be stigma, which I suppose is why it's so helpful, that iCAAD have come to Paris, and I think in Anglo-Saxon countries possibly slightly less stigma because of more culturally acceptable ways of thinking about addiction as an illness. But nonetheless, I think your man in the street, probably wherever you are, sees addiction essentially as some sort of moral problem. And I think the addict tends to see that too.
Je crois qu'il y a une chose importante que tu as dite, Cosmo, là, qui est importante. C'est
Important thing that you said just now, Cosmo. This counter identity or this negative identity, and also the individual experience of the addict. And if I tie that into what David was saying about an addictive society and the trends, things are going faster and faster. We're more and more vulnerable, and vulnerability is seen as negative. It's a failure. It creates shame, guilt, and a profound negative identity. Is it only vulnerable publics, or is it just vulnerability that's negative? And in fact, ultimately, people are always vulnerable with a society that's going faster and faster. So the logic here is that we're creating, with our addictive societies, we're creating negative identities. And that's why the system is somewhat perverse. We're going towards a society of more comforts. We consume more. Vulnerability becomes a problem because things are changing too fast, and vulnerability goes against the collective image. Just to go back, what you were just saying, what you were both saying, I agree with the idea that stigma will always exist, but what I intend to do is to highlight this paradox that we're enjoined often to consume more, but the people that can't consume adequately is stigmatized. Consuming is normative, even if norms are changing, of course, but the person who can't consume in a normative way is stigmatized. I come from Normandy, Le Havre. We have the Dreyfus case of the poor. So there's a union member of dockers, there's a unionist of dockers who was wrongly accused of murder. And he was decredibilized. And the way of decredibilizing was to say that he drank water. So he's not a docker. He's not like a docker. The dockers in Le Havre at the start of this 20th century, they were paid in tokens from bars. So drinking is a very strong part of their identity. So I'm using that as a contrast. Is this paradox? At some point, we must all consume, but the person who chooses the wrong object or the wrong intensity is stigmatized. And I think it's not to say that we mustn't have stigma, and we need to believe in a bright, beautiful future. I think that's utopian. It's nice it helps to move things, it helps progress, but it's unrealistic. But we need to contrast this so that patients can find the resources within themselves to say that we can escape to a certain extent from this social determinism, that there is just one part of society that you need to take on board. So we have 2 minutes if you want to answer, if you want to respond.
It's really the way. Either you're consuming in an out of control way, so you're deviant in that sense, or else you're abstinent, and you're deviant in that sense in a consumerist society. So the poor old addict, I think, has a tough time either side. Those would be my final thoughts. Yeah.
Merci. Je voudrais dire quelque chose.
Thank you. I'd just like to say something. If we applied strict medical norms and strict psychopathological norms in our society, we wouldn't have had Beethoven, we wouldn't have had Einstein, we wouldn't have had Van Gogh. They would have been in mental health centers. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the forces of change involve pain and change, the fact that you're not fitting in when you want to create something new. But I don't want to forget people who've sacrificed and suffered to move humanity forward. And that's very poignant. I think it's very poignant to look at that. So I just wanted to throw that out there at the end. I would like to thank you both. Thank you very much. I think we have a half-hour break, and then we are looking at something similar but different with Stu Fenton on the LGBT community. Thank you very much to both of you.